the Shah who loved Hollywood, and the country that became Washington's nightmare. In 1971, Iran staged one of the most lavish celebrations in human history. To mark the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi invited the global elite. Princes, presidents, billionaires, all gathered in golden tents in the desert. Service flown in from Paris, wine from Bordeaux, a banquet by Maxims of Paris, handmade carpets, fireworks, opera performances. Iran at its peak, modern, luxurious, westernized. In the streets of Tehran, American cars, French fashion houses, cinemas screening Hollywood films, women without hijabs, young men listening to the Beatles, universities teaching in English. Iran looked like a project. This is what the Islamic world could become, if properly reformed. Washington was thrilled. The Shah was their man, reliable, secular, staunchly anti-communist. He bought American weapons, opened oil markets, and ensured regional stability, all in exchange for unwavering U.S. support. But behind the glitter, cracks, rural poverty, repression, a secret police force, and growing anger from the religious establishment. Soon, that glossy showcase would shatter. Tehran would change its face. Not cosmopolitan princesses, but black veils. Not greetings from Washington, but chants of death to America. America didn't lose Iran over years. It lost it in mere months. What seemed like a fortress of modernity in the East turned into a fanatical state burning with anti-Western fury. How did this happen? And why did Iran become not just a former ally, but a personal nemesis of the United States? By the time the West was still sketching out the idea of the nation-state in the 18th century, Iran already had over 2,500 years of continuous civilizational memory. This was the land of ancient empires, of great religions, where power and poetry merged into something monumental. Persia, the Achaemenids, the Sassanids, the Safavids, each dynasty left a mark. The grandeur of Persepolis, the elegance of Isfahan, the poetry of Hafez and Rumi. Iran wasn't just a country. It was a civilizational statement. But by the 19th century, that statement had begun to fade. Persia became a prize in the geopolitical tug-of-war between the British and Russian empires. What the West called the Great Game was, in reality, a scramble for dominance over trade routes, resources, and influence. Iran turned into a buffer zone, a territory of influence where Shahs took more guidance from British diplomats than their own viziers. The Iranian economy was dependent on concessions, contracts that gave foreigners the rights to drill oil, build railways, even run customs. In 1901, British Baron William Knox D'Arcy secured a concession for oil extraction. This would become the most lucrative deal of the 20th century, laying the foundation for what would later be British Petroleum, BAP. At the same time, Iran witnessed a constitutional revolution, 1905 to 1911, as people demanded limits on royal power, a parliament, and structural reforms. But these changes were crushed by foreign interference, internal corruption, and a weak state. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan came to power, later crowning himself as Reza Shah Pahlavi. He launched a sweeping modernization campaign, secularization, railroads, banning the hijab, and promoting Persian nationalism. But the cost was high. Iran grew even more dependent on the West. And here we see the paradox that would define Iran, caught between imperial pride and political humiliation, between the legacy of ancient empires and the reality of foreign control. In this historical soil, the revolution was already taking root. In the early 1950s, Iran stood at the edge of a major shift, not revolutionary, but democratic. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic lawyer and reformist, became prime minister. He believed Iran had a right to sovereignty. His main idea: nationalize Iranian oil, which had been under de facto control of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the future BP, since the early 20th century. Mossadegh wasn't a Marxist. He was a nationalist with liberal leanings. But to London, he posed a threat to imperial revenues. To Washington, he was a red flag during the height of the Cold War. If Iran broke the model of the friendly oil monarchy, what would stop others from doing the same? Britain retaliated, blocking Iranian oil exports and launching a diplomatic siege. But when it became clear that Mossadegh wouldn't back down, the CIA stepped in. In 1953, with President Eisenhower's approval, Operation Ajax was launched, the CIA's first orchestrated coup in a sovereign country. Under the direction of Agent Kermit Roosevelt, yes, the grandson of Theodore, the plan followed a now familiar playbook: bribe newspapers, stage provocations, organize fake protests, and rally military factions. Within days, Tehran descended into chaos. Clashes on the streets, fires, accusations. The Shah, who had previously fled, returned with American backing. Mossadegh was arrested. Democracy was dissolved. The West celebrated. The model of a manageable state was preserved. Iran returned to monarchy, this time with a Shah who was not just a king, but a client of Washington. For Iran, it was a trauma, deep, unforgotten. Many saw 1953 as the moment Iran lost its chance at a modern independent democracy without clerical rule. The 1979 revolution would be, in many ways, a delayed backlash to this humiliation. The CIA, meanwhile, took notes. Operation Ajax became a template for future coups around the world, from Guatemala to Chile. And Iran learned its lesson. The West didn't want democracy. It wanted control. After the 1953 coup, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah restored to power by the CIA, didn't just reclaim his throne. He gained a new image, a monarch of modernization, a benevolent autocrat, poised to transform Iran into a model of Western-style progress and a loyal U.S. ally. The 1960s and 70s were a period of rapid transformation. The Shah launched the White Revolution, a sweeping series of reforms: land redistribution, educational expansion, women's rights, and industrial development. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it was rapid modernization with no grassroots support. Land was seized from aristocrats, but poorly redistributed. Rural areas sank into poverty. Cities expanded chaotically. Universities opened and filled with dissent. Meanwhile, Iran became both an oil supplier and a client of the American military-industrial complex. The Shah purchased jets, tanks, air defense systems. Iran's army grew to over 400,000 troops. U.S. advisors filled ministries, military academies, and development agencies. Washington praised Iran as a stabilizing force and bulwark against communism. Beneath the armor, though, was a fracture. The Shah's regime was brutally authoritarian. The secret police, Savak, was among the most feared in the region. Thousands of political opponents were arrested, tortured, or exiled. Censorship was rampant. A cult of personality flourished. Most dangerously, a growing disconnect between ruler and ruled became impossible to ignore. Tehran glittered with neon and Dior, while the provinces languished in poverty. The Shah reigned in palaces, while his people were watched. Social justice became a slogan, not a policy. Oil money funded monuments to the regime, not the nation. American officials either didn't notice or didn't care. To Washington, Iran was an aircraft carrier on land, a strategic platform in the heart of the Middle East. The Shah was our dictator, and that was enough. As for the discontent, it was labeled resistance to progress. No one suspected that beneath the asphalt and air bases, a revolution was already rumbling. While the West celebrated Iran's economic miracle, a very different movement was gaining strength, one that never graced magazine covers, never dined in royal palaces, and never appeared in Washington's briefings. But it was this movement, Islamic resistance, that was quietly preparing the revolution that would destroy the Shah's golden age. At its center stood Ruhollah Khomeini, a stern and austere Ayatollah, a professor of Islamic jurisprudence from the holy city of Qom. In 1963, he publicly denounced the Shah's white revolution, accusing him of selling out Iran to the West and betraying Islam. The Shah responded harshly, arresting Khomeini and later exiling him to Turkey and then to Iraq. It was in exile that the so-called cassette revolution began. Khomeini recorded sermons and political messages on tapes which were smuggled into Iran, copied, and passed hand to hand. His messages were a blend of religious ethics, political defiance, and social justice. And they resonated. Khomeini had no state, no political party, no weapons. But he had a network built on three pillars: the clergy, an expanding base among young seminarians and mosque leaders; the bazaar, the traditional merchant class, resentful of Western-style modernization; the students, secular but radicalized by repression. Khomeini's voice echoed through mosques, bazaars, dormitories. His message spread faster than political manifestos because it ran deeper. It was religious, moral, historical. It mattered that Iran was Shia. Unlike Sunni Islam, Shi'ism is steeped in a theology of resistance and martyrdom. Every rebellion echoes Karbala, the death of Imam Hussein. In this narrative, the Shah became Yazid, the tyrant. Khomeini wasn't just a leader, he was a vessel of historical vengeance. The irony? Until the very end, the CIA underestimated him. U.S. intelligence reports as late as 1978 described Khomeini as a minor figure with limited support. In reality, he was already the beating heart of a revolution, not formed in bunkers, but in the souls of millions of Iranians. At the start of 1978, the Shah's regime seemed untouchable. He had the army, the police, oil revenues, and the full backing of the United States. But in truth, his power rested on fear, and fear is not a renewable resource. January 1978, a small protest erupts in the city of Qom after a state-run newspaper publishes an article insulting Khomeini. Security forces open fire. People die. 40 days later, another protest, more deaths. Then 40 days after that, another wave. This was more than grief. It was a Shia mourning cycle, now turned into revolutionary strategy. Religion became the calendar of rebellion. Strikes spread across the country, first students, then workers, and finally the oil industry. Within months, Tehran was paralyzed. Protesting wasn't an act of defiance, it was a ritual. Millions marched with placards, with portraits of Khomeini chanting, "Death to the Shah!" The Shah lost his grip. First he denied, then he cracked down, then he offered dialogue. Finally, he fled. In January 1979, he left Iran for medical treatment. In reality, he had gone into exile. He would never return. And on February 1st, 1979, Ruhollah Khomeini came back to Iran. He was met like a messiah. Over 1 million people flooded the streets. No political figure of the 20th century returned to their homeland with such fervor. By mid-February, the monarchy had collapsed. The army was disoriented. Generals refused to shoot civilians. Citizens seized army barracks, police stations. Within days, an entire political order that had taken decades to build vanished. This was no coup. This was a revolution that didn't just topple a king, it dismantled the Western vision for Iran. The people demanded justice, dignity, sovereignty, and they believed that Islam, not any secular ideology, would deliver it. As for America, it watched in disbelief. And soon, it would suffer one of the most humiliating foreign policy disasters in its history. On November 4th, 1979, several hundred Iranian students calling themselves followers of the Imam stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They breached the gates, seized the building, captured American diplomats, and burned classified documents. This marked the beginning of what would become the longest diplomatic crisis of the 20th century. 444 days of hostage captivity. What happened? Officially, the trigger was America's decision to admit the exiled Shah into the U.S. for medical treatment. But the rage ran deeper. For many Iranians, the U.S. Embassy was a symbol of colonial interference, the very place where the CIA's 1953 coup had been orchestrated, where spies once walked the halls, and where support for a despised dictator had been born. Ayatollah Khomeini endorsed the takeover. He called the embassy a nest of spies. The new revolutionary government, though fragmented, didn't oppose it. America was humiliated. President Jimmy Carter tried diplomacy, but pressure mounted. Protests erupted across the U.S. Shock turned into fury. Iran was no longer just a geopolitical rival. It became America's personal demon. In spring 1980, the U.S. launched Operation Eagle Claw, a rescue mission involving helicopters and special forces. But it ended in disaster, mechanical failures, desert sandstorms, and a deadly collision killed 8 American servicemen. The mission failed. The humiliation was total. Iran celebrated. Carter lost re-election. The hostages were finally released in 1981, on the very day Ronald Reagan took office. But the damage had been done. From that moment, America no longer viewed Iran as a country, but as an ideological enemy, one that had rewritten the rules of engagement. Iran in turn realized it could humiliate a superpower and survive. This was now a new kind of conflict, not armies on battlefields, but symbols, emotions, hostages, and televised shame. And America was unprepared for that kind of war. The revolution had triumphed, but the euphoria didn't last. In September 1980, just a year and a half after the Shah's fall, Iran was attacked by its neighbor, Iraq, led by a young, ambitious, and ruthless Saddam Hussein. He believed Iran was weak, fractured by revolution and chaos, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Thus began a war that would last 8 brutal years, millions killed or wounded, chemical weapons, city bombings, mass mobilizations. Iran, freshly cut off from much of the world, fought almost alone. The West, especially the United States, backed Iraq, supplying weapons, intelligence, and funding. The U.S., once Iran's closest ally, now played against it through Baghdad. But Iran endured. From the mud, hatred, and isolation emerged a new identity, the Islamic Republic under siege. The war didn't weaken the regime, it strengthened it. Ayatollah Khomeini wasn't just the leader of a revolution anymore. He became the commander of national resistance. And after the war, no peace, just sanctions. The U.S. imposed layers of economic, technological, and financial restrictions. Europe joined in, half-heartedly. But Iran didn't vanish. It adapted, developed its own arms industry, built underground facilities, and created a shadow economy. By the 1990s, a new Western fear emerged, Iran's nuclear program. Ironically, it was the U.S. that had originally helped Iran begin nuclear research back in the 1970s under the Shah. Now, however, panic. Was Iran building a bomb, or just chasing technology? Or perhaps more dangerously, did it simply want the symbol that it could? U.S. presidents, one after another, labeled Iran a threat. But each new round of isolation only deepened Tehran's belief that America was not seeking compromise, only capitulation. Iran responded with proxy wars, supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, extending influence in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. No formal armies, no declared wars, but real battles, real deaths. Iran didn't become a superpower, but it became a regional power you couldn't ignore. Since the 1980s, Iran has not just been an enemy for the United States. It became a meme, a phobia, a conveniently unchanging adversary. No other country has occupied such a place in the American psyche, not the Soviet Union, not China, not even North Korea. Iran is personal. The Western media machine fuels this image. Black hijabs, chants of death to America, burning flags. Israel, America's closest ally in the Middle East, reinforces this narrative. Iran is the top threat. Not terrorism, not climate change, not economic crises. Iran because it is the only nation openly questioning Israel's right to exist. U.S. presidents come and go, but the tone remains. Republicans take an aggressive stance, axis of evil, state sponsor of terrorism. Democrats are more cautious, but the message is the same. Iran must change. This image of immutable evil is useful for rallying public support, justifying military budgets, and explaining foreign interventions. The irony? Iran and the U.S. have cooperated secretly. The Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, when Washington sold arms to Tehran to fund right-wing militias in Nicaragua, cooperation against ISIS in the 2010s. But publicly, hostility, mutual, toxic, symbolic. Why Iran? Because it's a mirror, one in which the U.S. sees an alternative vision of the Middle East, not secular, not liberal, not pro-Western. It's a country that survived a revolution against the West and didn't collapse. It stands as proof that another model exists, and that's an ideological threat. Iran isn't just a challenge, it's an obsession. For decades, American foreign policy has been unable to let go of the Iran card. Every administration repeats the same mantra. Iran is a threat, but we must talk, but not trust, but isolate, but engage. Inside Iran, this only strengthens hardliners. See, they don't want peace. They want our destruction. This is no longer a geopolitical conflict. It's a psychodrama. Two regimes, two narratives, two myths. And neither side wants to wake up. Iran and the United States are not just locked in a geopolitical conflict. They are entangled in a historical allegory, a narrative where, for over 45 years, two nations have waged a war without a war, through proxies, sanctions, rhetoric, espionage, and displays of might. But today, in the 2020s, the world is once again on the edge. Attacks on U.S. bases, targeted strikes on Iranian generals, a reactivated nuclear program, Israel poised for direct confrontation with Tehran, America cycling through new sanctions and war scenarios. This is no longer a Cold War. This is the eve of a hot one. Iran's story is not just about a Muslim republic. It's about how a revolution against empire can become an empire itself, how a victim becomes a player, and how trauma can calcify into ideology. From the American side, Iran is no longer seen as a nation, but as a challenge to its mission in the world, something to fix, defeat, or remake. And that's the paradox. Every U.S. action has only deepened Iran's defiance. Yes, there's oil, there's religion, there's strategy. But at its core, this conflict is emotional. For Iranians, the trauma is 1953. For Americans, it's 1979. Neither side has forgotten. Is de-escalation possible? Technically, yes. Practically, it's hard. Because both sides have become addicted to the conflict. It legitimizes leaders, it explains domestic failures, and every time dialogue is within reach, something or someone sabotages it. But time moves on. A new generation of Iranians is no longer bound by the myth of Khomeini. A new generation of Americans is not shaped by Cold War doctrine. And maybe, just maybe, they can be the first to say, we don't see you as the enemy, but as a chapter of history we must finally close. Because if they don't, the next war won't be just another Middle Eastern crisis. It will be an explosion of the past into the future, one that destroys more than armies. It will destroy hope. In the previous episode, we explored Iran, a nation that rose against the West and became its enduring obsession. But every geopolitical drama needs its opposite. And in this Middle Eastern tragedy, that opposite was Iraq, a country that chose a different revolution, a different path, and a far darker ending. In the 1980s, while Iran shouted, "Death to America," Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, received U.S. intelligence, financial support, biotechnologies, and tacit political backing. Washington saw him as a bulldog to unleash against the Islamic Republic. But within 15 years, America would brand this former partner the enemy of humanity. And 10 years later, it would invade, overthrow, and execute him. So, who was Saddam Hussein? A brutal dictator, a pan-Arab hero, or just another pawn in an imperial board game? In 1983, Saddam Hussein received a non-classified message from Washington. Ronald Reagan sent a personal emissary to Baghdad, Donald Rumsfeld. The handshake was warm. The talk was business. The mood, cooperative. At the same time, just a year earlier, Iraq had already used chemical weapons against Iran. America knew, and not only remained silent, it provided intelligence to help make the attacks more effective. Thus begins one of the most morally disturbing stories in modern geopolitics. How the U.S. helped Saddam Hussein kill, while it was useful, then labeled him the new Hitler. In September 1980, Iraq launched an attack on Iran. The reasons? Territorial disputes, fear of revolutionary contagion, and Saddam Hussein's personal ambitions. He wanted to become the new leader of the Arab world. and crush the unstable newborn Islamic Republic. The West watched and did nothing. Then it began to help. The U.S. didn't declare an alliance with Iraq, but through the CIA it provided intelligence on Iranian troop movements. Iraq used this data for its bombing campaigns. Meanwhile, American companies supplied chemical precursors later used to produce sarin and mustard gas. Yes, Iraq, in the 1980s, became the only country to use chemical weapons on a massive scale in warfare since World War II against soldiers, against civilians, including its own Kurdish population in Halabja. America knew and said nothing. In Washington, the justification was simple. Iran is worse. To the Reagan administration, the Islamic Republic was more than an enemy. It was an ideological threat. Saddam was aggressive, authoritarian, but ours, and useful. U.S. support wasn't overt, but it was effective. Loans routed through third parties, dual-use technologies, and silence in international forums. Even when Iraq attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, the U.S. didn't condemn it. Instead, it began escorting its own ships to protect interests. In 1988, the war ended. Neither side won. Millions dead, economies shattered. But Iraq emerged with a dangerous illusion. America stayed silent, so it must approve. That would be Saddam Hussein's fatal miscalculation. Saddam as a strategic partner of the West. In the early 1980s, Saddam Hussein wasn't the next Hitler or a child-killing tyrant. He was a secular Arab leader fighting Islamic extremism. The West didn't isolate Iraq. On the contrary, it built a partnership. The U.S. supplied intelligence, dual-use technologies, grain and credit lines through commercial channels. France provided nuclear reactors and Exocet missiles. In 1981, Israel bombed the Osirak reactor, built by France, fearing Saddam had nuclear ambitions. West Germany sold chemical precursors under the guise of industrial use, which were then turned into poison gas. The Soviet Union delivered tanks, aircraft, artillery. Moscow saw Iraq as the lesser evil in a turbulent region. The West supported Saddam not out of love, but cold calculation. He kept Iran in check, contained Syria, and suppressed the Kurds. And it worked, as long as no one looked too closely. Because Saddam wasn't just a president, he was a power-obsessed paranoiac who saw himself as the embodiment of Arab rebirth, a lifelong Ba'athist, brutal, suspicious, and ruthless. His regime was built on surveillance, public executions, and a cult of personality bordering on pharaonic. In 1979, just after taking power, Saddam convened a party congress and publicly read out a list of traitors from within his own leadership. 22 top officials were marched out mid-session and executed. The rest applauded, not fear, but a spectacle of fear. He built palaces, erected bronze statues of himself, authored novels that officers were forced to read. All media spoke with his voice, all critics were enemies, all bridges bore his name. Brutality wasn't a side effect, it was a tool. Thousands disappeared, prisons overflowed, torture was standard, yet the West viewed it all through the lens of geopolitics. Maybe he's brutal, but at least he's stable. That excuse would become America's most dangerous illusion. In the 1980s, Iraq wasn't just a state. It was a regime of fear, scaled to the level of national policy. Saddam Hussein used every tool available, from school informants to poison gas, to crush any form of resistance. One of his worst atrocities was the Anfal campaign against the Kurds in 1987-1988. Over 180,000 people, most of them civilians, were killed or deported. Its climax came in Halabja, March 1988. Iraqi aircraft dropped chemical bombs, mustard gas, sarin, VX. Over 5,000 people died, mostly women and children. Was the world shocked? No. The United States did not condemn the attack. Instead, the CIA tried to shift the blame to Iran. That same year, after another gas attack on Iranian troops, U.S. satellites recorded the evidence. Intelligence confirmed Iraq was using chemical weapons in mass atrocities. And what did Washington do? Blocked a UN resolution. Why? Political calculus. Iraq was a bulwark against Iran, a key player in the Gulf, not an enemy, not yet. Meanwhile, inside Iraq, Saddam unleashed purges against Shiites, dissidents, soldiers, even his own family. Brothers-in-law, generals, former allies, executed without trial. The press was silent. The international community willfully blind. It was a moment when the world should have said no, and didn't, when morality was traded for pragmatism. And that is why, when the U.S. would invade Iraq 15 years later, claiming he killed his own people, the world would respond, "Where were you when it happened?" By 1990, Iraq was exhausted. 8 years of war with Iran had devastated the economy. Saddam expected gratitude, debt relief, maybe aid. Instead, he got isolation, shortages, and billions owed to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And Kuwait, in Saddam's eyes, was provoking him. Overproducing oil, driving prices down, tapping disputed fields along the Iraq-Kuwait border. In Baghdad, this was seen as economic sabotage and a deep insult. To many Iraqi nationalists, Kuwait wasn't a foreign state. It was historically part of Iraq, carved off by colonial powers. That summer, Saddam summoned U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie. They met. Saddam voiced his grievances, and Glaspie replied with what would become a legendary line: "The United States has no opinion on Arab border disputes." Was it diplomatic neutrality or a green light? Saddam decided. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Within 2 days, it had occupied the entire country. And then, the West exploded. The same Saddam who had once received American intelligence was now an aggressor, a threat to the global order, a new Hitler. President George H.W. Bush gave a defining speech. This is not simply about Kuwait. It's about the future of the world. Iraq must withdraw. The UN acted swiftly. Sanctions, resolutions. A coalition of over 30 nations formed. By January 1991, Operation Desert Storm had begun. America was now at war with Iraq, their former partner, now the enemy. The irony? Saddam reportedly never understood what went wrong. "I didn't do anything new," he later said. "I simply followed the rules of power I was taught." January 1991. After months of ultimatums, diplomacy, and troop buildup, the U.S. and its allies launched a massive military operation. Operation Desert Storm. Within weeks, Iraq faced one of the most intense aerial bombardments in history. Over 100,000 sorties, strikes on military bases, energy grids, communications, even civilian infrastructure. This was the first war broadcast live. CNN delivered glowing green night vision footage. Americans watched the war like a reality show. It looked precise, high-tech, almost clean. But on the ground, chaos. Iraqi troops torched over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells. Black smoke choked the skies. An ecological disaster followed. Toxic rains, poisoned water, animals drowning in crude. The ground campaign lasted less than a week. Iraq's military was shattered. Kuwait was liberated. And then came the question, should the U.S. march on Baghdad? The general said no. President George H.W. Bush made the call. Saddam stays. The official reason? Regional stability. The unofficial one? We don't know what to do with Iraq after the war. But for Saddam, this wasn't victory. It was humiliation. His army returned broken. Sanctions were total. And inside Iraq, rebellions erupted. Kurds in the north, Shiites in the south. Saddam crushed them in blood, while America watched. It was the first time the West left behind a war half finished. And that decision would breed exactly what it feared most: Iraqi resentment, American illusions of control, and a future war that wouldn't be televised, but would never end. After the 1991 war, Iraq fell under the most severe international sanctions ever imposed. Oil exports were placed under UN control. Imports were tightly restricted. Medicines, technologies, and spare parts were blocked. The famous Oil for Food program was introduced. Iraq could sell oil, but only in exchange for humanitarian goods and under strict supervision. On paper, it was a compromise. In reality, a slow-motion siege. Iraq lost access to medicine, modern health care, and clean water systems. Infrastructure destroyed in the war was never rebuilt. Hospitals were barren. No chlorine, no antibiotics, frequent blackouts. Within a decade, child mortality doubled. Pediatric cancer became a death sentence. Inflation wiped out wages. Schools crumbled. Families survived on rations. And still, that wasn't the worst of it. Saddam Hussein's regime, increasingly isolated and paranoid, evolved into a hyper-repressive state machine. It controlled everything: markets, media, universities, even cultural clubs. Every opponent was an agent of the West. Every hardship, the fault of an American conspiracy. This was a society under siege. Suspicion of the outside world deepened, and with it grew a dangerous thought. Maybe we need strength again. Underground, a new generation was forming. Officers, intelligence operatives, ideologues. Saddam was preparing for revenge, and America forgot Iraq. Focused on the Balkans, Russia, the economy. But when it returned, not with sanctions, but with an army, it would discover a country transformed. More bitter, more closed, more dangerous. September 11th, 2001 changed everything. The U.S. was in shock. The world on edge. And almost immediately, alongside the war in Afghanistan, Washington began to remember Iraq. Publicly, there was no clear link between Saddam and al-Qaeda. But in the media, in speeches and behind closed doors, a new narrative emerged. Saddam is a threat. He has weapons of mass destruction. We can't wait until he uses them. The Bush administration assembled evidence. The most iconic moment came in February 2003, when Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN Security Council. He held up a small vial, supposedly anthrax, satellite images, testimony from defectors. The world listened. The world hesitated, but it wasn't convinced. France, Germany, and Canada opposed the war. The UN refused to authorize an invasion, but the U.S., with the UK and a few allies, decided to go it alone. In March 2003, The invasion began. Shock and awe was the opening salvo. By April, Baghdad fell. Iraqi forces didn't resist for long. Saddam's regime collapsed within weeks. But the weapons of mass destruction? Never found. No nuclear program, no biological arsenal, no chemical caches. It was all a mirage. Worse still, the U.S. had no plan for what came next. The Iraqi army was disbanded. The administration paralyzed. Chaos erupted. Looting, insurgency, collapse. A closed dictatorship quickly became a power vacuum, inviting everyone, from Al-Qaeda to Iranian intelligence, to step in. Later, Colin Powell would admit, "It's a blot on my record. We misled the world." And the war that began as a mission to save the world would become America's longest, costliest, and most senseless conflict. In December 2003, U.S. forces found Saddam Hussein hiding in a hole near Tikrit, the former leader of the nation, bearded, disheveled, broken. He surrendered without a fight, the Pentagon reported, but Saddam was still alive. The trial began. It was public, international. He was charged with mass murder, genocide against the Kurds, political repression. He denied all guilt, called the tribunal a puppet court of the occupiers. He looked defiant, even proud. To many in the Arab world, he became a martyr who never bowed. In December 2006, after sentencing, Saddam was hanged. The video spread across the internet, and it became a symbol not of justice, but of vengeance. Inside Iraq, chaos, no army, a weak police force, a corrupt government. The old balances shattered. A civil war erupted between Sunnis and Shiites. Daily terror attacks. Hundreds of deaths per week. Iranian agents, Sunni insurgents, U.S. patrols, Kurdish militias, everyone against everyone. In this vacuum, a new force emerged, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS. Its core? Former Saddam-era officers, U.S. prison detainees, and radicals. They united out of humiliation, chaos, and a hunger for revenge. Iraq, once a stable if brutal state, became a permanent war zone. The dream of democracy after dictatorship collapsed. Instead, the world got a new reality. Stateless zones, jihadist armies, refugee waves, and a lost generation. In the 1980s, the U.S. backed Saddam Hussein, turned a blind eye to chemical attacks, aided his war with Iran, considered him a useful authoritarian stabilizer. In the 1990s, it labeled him Hitler, bombed his army, imposed crushing sanctions, and created a humanitarian disaster. In the 2000s, it invaded, toppled, executed, and left behind ruins. This is not just a story about Iraq. It is a story about the West, about how short-term strategy becomes self-destruction, how supporting a dictator for stability breeds future war, how liberation without a plan leads to deeper tyranny or a vacuum that devours everything. Iraq became a mirror for America. In it, the U.S. saw its addiction to oil, its belief in exporting democracy via bombs, its hypocrisy, punishing crimes it once helped commit. And Iraq? It's a country still living in the shadow of its past, where young people have never known peace, where politics is war and trust is a luxury. But it is also a place of new voices, new movements, fragile attempts to stitch a broken society back together. Perhaps Iraq will rise again. Perhaps America will learn. But one thing is clear. Empires that betray their allies eventually betray themselves. We've just concluded the story of how the U.S. destroyed Iraq, toppled Saddam, and left behind a vacuum, a space where ISIS rose as a new, terrifying force. But ISIS wasn't just another terrorist group. It was a brand, a message, an aesthetic, one that didn't just kill but also recruited, mesmerized, and simulated heroism. Terrorism had changed its language, from VHS sermons to TikTok edits, from desert speeches to drone footage cut like a battlefield trailer. Our next story is about how jihad became a game. Imagine scrolling through TikTok and landing on a video that opens with an explosion. It's tightly edited, fast-paced, set to dramatic music. The stakes? Life and death. The comments? Allahu Akbar. Level up. Shaheed mode unlocked. This isn't a trailer for the next Call of Duty. This is real terrorist propaganda, and it works. It recruits. It excites. It draws you in. Jihad today isn't just about AKs and prayer. It's about GoPros, Telegram, drones, and live streams. It's heroism simulated through Instagram filters. And while governments are slow to react, terrorists have already gone viral. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel if you're drawn to stories that show how the world is changing. Slowly, but relentlessly. And leave us a comment. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? We truly want to see the map of our audience. The 1990s, VHS and Songs of Death. Before YouTube or Telegram existed, jihadists had already begun creating their own cinema. In the 1990s, Al-Qaeda distributed tapes with sermons, martyrdom tributes, and attack footage. Sold at bazaars, passed through mosques, mailed discreetly, these were the first visual tools of terror. Crude, but powerful. The soundtrack, nasheed chants. The imagery, strikes, funerals, tears. The message, martyrdom, the glory of jihad, the path to paradise. The 2000s, YouTube becomes jihad's pulse. After 9/11, everything changed. Jihadists turned to open digital platforms. YouTube flooded with videos from Iraq, Afghanistan, Chechnya. The next level arrived. Editing, camera angles, slow motion, cinematic scores. YouTube became a death trend machine. Some groups even posted weekly chronicles of attacks. Week by week, jihad grew more media savvy, copying MTV, news outlets, even ad formats. The 2010s, ISIS as game director. But ISIS changed the game. From 2014 to 2016, they weren't just a group, they were a media empire. They built Al-Hayat, their own production studio. Their videos looked like Hollywood trailers. GoPros on fighters' helmets, drone footage, color grading, graphics. They mimicked Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, Grand Theft Auto, public executions, directed like horror films, battle footage, first-person shooter style, recruitment ads, looked like travel vlogs with job offers. The 2020s, TikTok, and the aesthetic of war today, jihad has no center, but it has a visual language. On TikTok and Instagram, you'll find war vlogs, masked fighters in fields, emojis, drill beats, nasheed edits. Some are real, others staged. But the goal is always the same: to lure, to dazzle, to make death look like glory. In 2015, a 16-year-old from Belgium received a message on Telegram. "We see you're searching for meaning. Your soul is ready. Want to play the real game with death and eternity?" This isn't fiction. This was recruitment. And there were thousands like it. Telegram. Jihad's dark messenger ISIS didn't choose Telegram by accident. The app allowed private groups, anonymous users, mass sharing of photos, videos, instructions. By 2016, there were recruitment channels that looked like RPG lobbies. Posts read, "Join the Ummah, level up, complete your mission." It felt like a quest. Introduction, vetting, ideological lessons. action plan, Discord, forums, and jihadi quests. Many young recruits from Europe and the U.S. were first contacted through gaming chats. Discord, Steam, Reddit. These became platforms for spiritual conversations that gradually moved to private messages. The mechanics resembled a video game. Profile, your views, age, location. Quest, read this, watch this, report back. Test, are you ready to go all the way? Reward, status, recognition, promise of heroism. The psychology was simple. Teenagers playing Fortnite or PUBG already processed violence as reflexive gameplay. Jihadist content adapted to that culture and became part of the game. Real cases, recruitment by the numbers. USA, a 17-year-old in Texas planned an attack after 6 months on Telegram. France, a 14-year-old girl became the admin of a forum distributing ISIS propaganda. Tunisia, entire football fan clubs were converted into radical cells through gaming chats. And it wasn't just ISIS. Al-Qaeda, HTS, and others began creating gamified shells around their ideology. Because when the promise of paradise for killing is framed like a game level, motivation becomes terrifyingly real. Before pulling the trigger, the ISIS fighter turned on his GoPro. He wasn't just shooting, he was recording a let's play, like in a game, like a first-person shooter, like a vlog. Graphics, adrenaline, achievements. ISIS fighters often filmed their attacks from a first-person perspective. The footage mimicked gameplay, drone shots like RTS game maps, gunfire synced with music, every kill marked like an achievement. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was a shift in how war was perceived. In classical Islam, a martyr was a figure of humility. In ISIS media, he became a hyperhero, completing a mission. The psychology of play, pain as quest, death as trophy. In games, death isn't the end. It's a respawn, a new life, a new level. And that's exactly what jihadist narratives offered. You don't die. You switch to paradise. Every attack is a mission. The enemy is a bot, not a human. This wasn't just dehumanization of the other. It was a reprogramming of self-perception. If martyrdom is the final level, then pain is irrelevant. Life is just a checkpoint. The Cyber Ummah, brotherhood without borders. Another key feature of gamified jihad was the online community. The Ummah, the Muslim global community, became virtual. Forums, Telegram, Discord, even Roblox channels, all were used to simulate a family. In this Cyber Ummah, there's no race, nationality, or age, only status, activity, loyalty. Just like in a game, the more you play, the higher your rank. Simulation replaces reality. And the scariest part, jihad in video form stopped looking like real death. No blood, no screaming, just action, not tragedy, but a cinematic climax. This creates a generation for whom a terror attack is not horror, but an episode. A generation for whom the line between real and virtual has long vanished. The video of journalist James Foley's execution in 2014 shocked the world. Only then did governments begin to realize the internet is no longer just a platform. It's a battlefield. Until 2015, most Western governments treated online jihadist propaganda as mere psychological warfare. But they missed the core issue, the format, the style, the aesthetic, the very things that captivated youth. It wasn't just ideology, it was content tailored to the rules of Instagram and YouTube. Short, visually intense, emotionally charged, highly shareable. And jihadists understood algorithms better than policymakers. For years, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter amplified jihadist content. Their systems measured engagement, not ethics. The result? Users interested in Islam or Middle East issues were recommended extremist videos or invited to anonymous chats, where things got real. After 2017, under pressure, tech giants began to delete thousands of videos, suspend accounts, implement fact-checking systems. But jihad simply leveled up. They moved into gaming channels, streaming platforms, bot networks. Terror content now hides in music, memes, and art edits. And worst of all, it's nurturing a new generation of tech-native radicals. We're entering a new phase. Today, it's possible to create a deep-fake imam preaching jihad, launch VR missions where teens train virtually, simulate paradise, combat, martyrdom, all in the language of game design. Jihad as a game is no longer a metaphor. It's a tactic. And the fight against it isn't just military or political. It's a war for imagination, content, and the human psyche. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If you find value in deep, slow stories that connect technology, psychology, and geopolitics, subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to comment. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? We truly want to see the global face of our audience.